I'm delighted to have you as part of this community. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to another exciting video where we'll be shedding light on 1945 Baseball Hall of Fame balloting. Elections to the Baseball Hall of Fame for 1945 included the first regular election conducted in 3 years and a strong response to criticism of the slow pace of honors. The Baseball Writers Association of America BBWAA voted by mail to select from recent players, and elected no one. The Old Timers Committee responded by electing the biggest class yet, 10 people. The selections by the committee, announced in April 1945, were Roger Bresnahan, Dan Brouthers, Fred Clarke, Jimmy Collins, Ed Delahanty, Hugh Duffy, Hughie Jennings, King Kelly, Jim O'Rourke, and Wilbert Robinson. After the baseball centennial and grand opening of the Hall of Fame in 1939, the BBWAA had determined to vote only every third year. After electing 3 players that year, it elected one in 1942 and none in 1945. New rules now provided that the writers would return to voting on recent players annually. As we progress, let's zoom in on 1940 for background and examine its role in shaping our overall narrative. In response to increasing complaints that the stars of the 19th century were being ignored, Commissioner Kenesaw Mountain Landis had in August 1944 enlarged the Hall of Fame committee from 4 members to 7. He had instructed them to elect a minimum of 10 players from the period when they met as the Old Timers Committee in early year goal the committee members believed would be relatively easy to meet, as some among them stated that the number of qualified candidates was likely over 2 dozen. After Landis' death in November 1944, the committee met briefly and elected Landis to the Hall of Fame. They also suggested that if the January 1945 election by the BBWAA failed to select any players whose careers extended into the initial years of the 20th century, some would be selected by the committee when they met in February. Brace yourself for an in-depth analysis as we navigate through BBWAA election and its far-reaching implications. Members of the BBWAA again had the authority to select any players active in the 20th century after 1900, provided they had not appeared in a major league game in 1944. Voters were instructed to cast votes for 10 candidates. Any candidate receiving votes on at least 75% of the ballots would be honored with induction to the Hall. A total of 247 ballots were cast, with 2,362 individual votes for 95 specific candidates, an average of 9.56 per ballot. 186 votes were required for election. The results were announced on January 28, 1945. The emphasis on the players of the ers and ers, who many voters felt should be given priority, again continued to increase beyond the levels seen in 1939 and 1942. Only 5 of the top 22 candidates in the voting, and none of the top 6, had seen any substantial play since 1917, only 3 of the top 36, and none of the top 22. Had played their final season any time between 1918 and 1933. 8 of the top 13 candidates were deceased. Players who had been retired over 27 years. 48 of the 94 named received 72% of the votes. For the first time in the 3 BBWAA elections, no candidate received at least 75% of the vote, particularly since the next election was not scheduled to be held until 1948, that a new generation of players was quickly becoming eligible, and that increasingly fractured voting patterns would make selections more improbable. Criticism became widespread that the election system needed to be reviewed and quickly revised. It was suggested that the Old Timers Committee might select some of the earliest popular candidates to help clear the top of the ballot. At its September 1945 meeting, the Hall of Fame Committee ordered that the 3-year wait between elections be abolished, and that annual elections resume under a revised format. Candidates who have since been selected in subsequent elections are indicated in italics. Players chosen by the Old Timers Committee in 1945 are marked with an asterisk. Players who were elected in future elections. These individuals are also indicated in plain italics. Key to colors. Brace yourself for an in-depth analysis as we navigate through Old Timers Committee and its far-reaching implications. In response to the failure of the BBWAA to select any inductees, the Old Timers Committee was encouraged to assist the BBWAA in clearing the congestion at the top of its ballot by including, among their 10 requested selections from the period, some players whose careers extended into the early 20th century, in particular, the 3 players gaining over 100 votes in the BBWAA election whose careers had peaked before 1905. The committee members were Hall of Fame President Stephen Celsius, Clarke, who chaired the committee, Hall of Fame Treasurer Paul South, the committee's secretary, Yankees President Ed Barrow, Athletics Animaniga Connie Mack, New York sportswriter Sid Mercer, Braves President Bob Quinn, and Boston sportswriter Mel Webb. The committee had initially planned to meet in February, but the long search for a successor to Landis, along with the retirements of Barrow and Quinn as club presidents, delayed the meeting until April 25, one day after Albert Happy Chandler was elected as the new commissioner. On that day, in the offices of the New York Yankees, 6 members of the committee met to make their selections. Sid Mercer could not attend due to a long illness which took his life 8 weeks later. Get ready to uncover the mysteries surrounding selections as we navigate its intriguing terrain. The committee, as requested, selected 10 inductees, the first 3 by unanimous vote. For Clarke, a left fielder, primarily with the Pittsburgh Pirates, from 1894 to 1911, he compiled a career batting average, and also led the team to 4 pennants in 16 seasons as manager, as well as the 1909 World Series title. He retired in 1915 with a Major League record 1602 career wins as a manager. Jimmy Collins, widely regarded as the greatest third baseman in the Major League's first 70 years, he batted over 5 times, finishing with that average, and also managed the Boston Americans to a victory in the first World Series in 1903. Wilbert Robinson, a catcher for 17 seasons, he caught a record 1108 games before 1900. He later served as the New York Giants pitching coach for 11 years, then managed Brooklyn for 18 seasons, winning 2 pennants. Upon his retirement, his win total as a manager trailed those of only John McGraw and Clarke in National League history. Roger Bresnahan, often regarded as the game's best catcher of the eras, and described by both McGraw and Branch Rickey as the greatest catcher they had ever seen. In 1907 he became the first Major League catcher to wishing wards, and was a capable player at every position. He was fast enough to bat leadoff, and remains the only catcher to steal over 200 bases in his career. He managed the Cardinals and Cubs for a total of 5 seasons, and was later a coach with the Giants and Tigers. Dan Brouthers, a star first baseman from 1879 to 1896 who won 5 batting titles, a 19th record, and retired with a career average, the game's greatest power hitter of the eras. He was the only 19th century player to have a career slugging percentage over. He later became a scout for the Giants. Ed Delahanty, a left fielder from 1888 to 1903, and the sport's greatest slugger of the eras, batting over 3 times. He won batting titles in both leagues and had a career average. He hit 4 home runs in 1 game in 1896 and had a 31-game hitting streak in 1899. He died at age 35 in 1903 when he fell from a bridge into the Niagara River after being put off a train. Hugh Duffy, a center fielder from 1888 to 1905 who starred primarily with the Boston Bean-Eaters. His batting average in 1894 remains the Major League record for a single season, and he retired with a career average of perhaps the best defensive outfielder of the era, as well as the first recognized Triple Crown winner. He later became a hitting coach for the Red Sox for a number of years, tutoring the young Ted Williams. Hughie Jennings, the fiery shortstop and team captain of the Baltimore Orioles in the Ers. He batted in 1896 and retired with an average. He later managed the Tigers from 1907 to 1920, winning pennants in his first 3 years. He left the Tigers trailing only Connie Mack and Clarke Griffith in career wins among AL managers. Afterward, he was a coach for the Giants on 4 consecutive pennant winners. Mike King Kelly, who starred as an outfielder and catcher with several teams from 1878 to 1893, and was an extraordinary base runner. He led the Chicago White Stockings to 5 pennants in the Ers, and retired with a batting average. He was always aware of the loopholes in the official rules, and some prominent figures in the game estimated that half of all the rules in baseball had been created in response to his exploiting their oversights. Along with manager teammate Cap Anson, he is often credited with devising the hit and run and the double steal. Jim O'Rourke, an outfielder from 1872 to 1893, and one of the game's earliest stars, played for 6 pennant winners in the Ers. Along with Cap Anson, he was one of 2 players to collect over 2,000 hits in the major leagues before 1893. He later played in the minor leagues until he was past 50. Of the 10 selections, only Clarke and Duffy were still living. The committee intended to consider the pitchers of the era at their next meeting in September, and to elect additional members at that time. When they met in Cooperstown on September 6, however, they focused instead on revising the widely criticized election process, and ordered that the BBWAA resume annual elections under a revised format which was hoped to facilitate more selections, the BBWAA having selected only 1 player in 6 years. Former National League President John Heidler participated in the meeting to replace those members who were deceased or otherwise unable to attend. Once the decision was made to hold the next election in 1946 rather than in 1948, the committee agreed to postpone the selection of pitchers and other candidates until they met in spring 1946. In the upcoming portion, we'll be dissecting other candidates to gain a comprehensive understanding of its implications. Among those candidates who were not elected by the Old Timers Committee at their April 1945 meeting, there were 5 who received particularly strong support or attention. The committee chose not to consider Clarke Griffith and Charles Kidd Nichols until pictures were more completely reviewed at their next meeting. Popular support to elect recently deceased President Franklin Roosevelt, in recognition of his support for baseball's continuation for morale purposes during World War II, was met with uncertainty on the committee's part as to whether they had the authority to elect someone who was never a major league player, manager, or executive. They opted to seek advice on this point before taking action in his case. The candidacy of Abner Doubleday, based on his supposed invention of baseball at Cooperstown in 1839, had become more controversial due to increasing skepticism regarding the historical basis for that belief. It was widely believed that the committee intended to seek further information either supporting or refuting the story before taking action. There was support for electing Jim Deacon White, a star catcher and third baseman of the Ers and Ers, but after choosing several candidates from the turn of the century and adding 3 stars of the Ers, the committee had fulfilled its initial obligation of 10 selections and chose to postpone further choices until meeting again. As we embark on the next leg of our journey, let's unpack the layers of criticism and rationale and examine its core elements. Although the committee's selections were roundly applauded at the time, in later years many baseball historians and writers came to believe strongly that the committee erred in some of its 1945 selections, and that too many individuals had been elected. However, this view does not consider the fact that the committee had been required to select 10 inductees that year. There are also several factors which make the reasons for their choices clearly discernible. 1. After the failed BBWAA election, the committee was primarily focused on assisting the BBWAA in relieving the congestion at the top of its ballot, and was encouraged to select some players who had played into the early 20th century and were receiving support in the BBWAA vote. Therefore, their selections that year tended to strongly favor the period between 1893, when baseball moved the pitcher back 10 feet from the plate, and 1910. All 10 of their selections were active players in 1893 or later, and 7 were active after 1900. 2. Of all the non-pitchers who had retired before 1910, only 5 have received more than 2 votes, 1% of the vote in the 1945 BBWAA election: Jimmy Collins 121, Delahanty 111, Hughie Jennings 92, Wilbert Robinson 81, and Hugh Duffy 64. All 5 were stars prior to 1900, with only Collins playing regularly after 1903, and each have received over 25% of the BBWAA vote. Every other non-pitcher retired before 1910 who had ever received over 2% of the BBWAA vote had already been elected. The committee elected all 5, and criticism of any of these choices is more appropriately directed at the BBWAA voters who supported their selection, as the Old-Timers Committee was acting simply out of agreement with their vote. 3. The committee apparently made an attempt to elect players at positions which were not yet represented in the Hall. In 1945, the BBWAA had elected 20th century players at every position except catcher, third base, and left field. The committee's election of Jimmy Collins corrected the absence of a third baseman, as he was generally regarded as the game's greatest player at the position to that time and had consistently finished first among third basemen in the BBWAA voting, usually outpulling the combined totals of all others at the position. His career spanned the years 1894 to 1908, easily allowing him to be considered a star in both centuries. The committee's choices at the other 2 positions also followed the BBWAA vote closely. Catcher Roger Bresnahan had finished first among catchers in most of the BBWAA elections, with only the recently retired Mickey Cochran competing for the top spot. In the voting since 1937, Fred Clarke had trailed only Ed Delahanty, who died in 1903, among left fielders. Both Bresnahan and Clarke were stars of the Ers who had made their major league debuts in the Ers, making them eligible for selection by the Old-Timers. 4. Among most of those following the elections, there was very strong sentiment to choose players who had remained in the sport as managers, coaches, or executives after retiring. 8 of the selections were major league managers at some point, with 5 Clarke, Collins, Jennings, King, Kelly, and Robinson leading their teams to pennants. Bresnahan, Jennings, and Robinson each served at least 5 seasons as coaches in the major leagues, and Duffy worked as a scout for many years. With the elections of Clarke, Robinson, and Jennings, 5 of the 9 retired managers with over 1,000 wins were now in the Hall, as well as the still active Connie Mack, with Clarke Griffith's candidacy deferred. There were 14 managers with at least 1,000 wins before 1945, all have since been elected, the last being Frank Selly in 1999. 5. There was a strong emphasis on those who had played central roles on championship teams, particularly the 3-time champion Baltimore Orioles of 1894, 95, 96, which were regarded by many as the greatest baseball dynasty of the 19th century. Dan Brouthers, Jennings, and Robinson were all regulars on that team, with Jennings also playing for a later Brooklyn champion and Brouthers starring for 3 earlier champions. Bresnahan had starred on the 1905 New York Giants. Collins was the playing manager of the 1903 Boston Americans and a star player for 2 NL champions of the late Ers. Duffy starred on 5 pennant winners in Boston in the Ers, and Clarke was the playing manager of 4 pennant winners in Pittsburgh. Kelly and Jim O'Rourke each starred on several pennant winners in the era before 1893. Of the 10 selections, 8 had been a starting player and a manager on at least 4 pennant winners. I hope you learned something new today. Let me know what you found most interesting in the comments below.